Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, wherever you are tuning in from. My name is Rabbi Mark Fishman. I'm the director of the Shah Learning Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our first program over this winter season, titled Halakha, Public Policy and the Sanctity of Life. Our guest and speaker today is Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody. Rabbi Brody is the executive director of the Halachic Organ Donor Society, and he was most recently the co-dean of the Tikvah Overseas program. He's a columnist for the Jerusalem Post since 2007, and Rabbi Brody's writings focus on making Jewish texts accessible to broader audiences while applying them to contemporary social and ethical dilemmas. Rabbi Brody is going to be speaking about a range of different topics touching on euthanasia, autopsies, and organ donation. And without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce all of you to Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi, for that kind introduction. It's great to be together with your Kehillah and this amazing venue. Exciting to see the new developments of the Shire Learning Center as a whole, and I'm really just looking forward to learning together over the coming weeks. So, as the Rabbi said, I'm going to be speaking about, I apologize in advance, by the way, I'm nursing a cold, but I think I'm sufficiently strong right now, but we'll be just fine. So as Rabbi Fishman said, I'm going to be speaking about issues related to end of life and public policy. Those of you who live in Montreal or in Canada as a whole know that the questions of end of life have become particularly, end of life care have become particularly acute when it comes to questions of MAID, medical assistance in dying, whether it's via euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. And so there's a lot going on in this topic in general. And what I want to try to show, though, in the next these few weeks, is that the issues of public policy and end-of-life care and halakha go back many, many years already. We've been thinking and dealing with these issues of what exactly are Jewish values and Jewish beliefs on these topics, and not talking about that in a vacuum, but in a real concrete setting in which the medical systems or the governments in which we live have certain conceptions. Some of the times those are very much compatible with Jewish thinking and Jewish law. Other times they're not. Other times we're not really sure because we, like everyone else, is trying to work out different ideas and different knowledge and different technology. And so what we're going to see in these few weeks is a process of rabbis and Jews trying to think through some of these issues in real time as the new technologies or medical innovations present new opportunities, but also great challenges to us. And so the first topic that I want to speak about relates to the issue of medical research on cadavers. Okay? And the reason why I'm starting with this issue is not because it's as pressing of an issue today as it was in past decades or centuries, but because I think it was in one of the first cases in which many of these issues sort of came to the fore, and that Jews suddenly had to think about these issues in a very concrete manner, particularly as it relates to the societies in which we live in which we're expected to partake, and we're expected also to contribute as well, as we'll see why that becomes sensitive. And I would argue, and I'll come back to this in a couple of weeks, I think that there is still a certain amount of remnants of the scars of this battle over medical research that continue to impact the way that many traditional Jews think about end-of-life issues and public policy as a whole. I can't prove that claim, but as we'll see over the next couple of weeks, I think there's something to say for it as we go along. Okay, so that's our topic for today. Next week, please God, will speak about organ donation, and then the following week, euthanasia. All right, so let's get started right away. As Rabbi Fishman stated, there's going to be time at the end for questions and conversation, but I encourage you to submit questions or thoughts in the chat which I can usually see along the way. And that way, if there are things that aren't so clear, I'll certainly try to address them as we go along. All right, I'm going to share my screen here for a minute. So the topic which we're going to discuss, and in particular here, relates to not only the issue of autopsies and medical research, but also the creation over Israel's medical schools. And one of the things that we're going to be speaking about in general is, when we talk about public policy, that's not an abstract question. Public policy is always being discussed in a particular time period, in a particular legal or cultural context. And that being the case, one of the interesting things we're going to see in this topic is how this issue took on a different tone in life when it was dealing with in the diaspora, starting first in Europe and then in North America. And then when it became an issue, an acute issue over in the state of Israel during the questions of founding of the first Israeli medical schools. Okay. And now, just to be clear, when we speak about autopsies, so the different types of cases, medical research, right, in which you can think about how people would use a cadaver, right? So one context is forensic autopsies, which isn't really our focus right today, but that's when we're trying to figure out, like, using signs from the body about how a person died, particularly if there are cases, questions of foul play or criminal issues, or it could be from a plague, right, or a virus, something like that, which has a different, unique type of issues related to public health, and we'll come back to that. But that's not really what we're speaking about so much. Much more today, we're speaking about the question of general medical study, training doctors and understanding how the body works, and occasionally as well general scientific knowledge in terms of understanding the pathology of diseases and whatnot. I presume that many of you are under the impression that Jewish law does not allow people to donate their bodies to science. I'm certainly not going to disagree with that today, but that whole question is partly one of the questions that are going to be coming up right now, and we're going to see why this became a very acute question of Jews and public policy. Now, this is only a modern issue. The issue of the study of anatomical study of the body for medical purposes is a modern issue for a simple reason. For many, many, many centuries, it just wasn't done. It wasn't done in the West, and it wasn't done in the East, meaning it was just what we didn't mess with the bodies. This was for cultural reasons or religious reasons. In general, humans did not understand or appreciate the importance of doing anatomical research. Much of medicine was partly scientific, partly philosophical. And this is why medicine was frequently wrong over many centuries. Quite frankly, was based on Galen's medicine for many centuries, and Galen never opened up a human body. So he didn't really know how everything worked and how everything was attached in the human body. By the way, for the same reason, this is why Chazal, the sages' medicine, sometimes in the Talmud, is just simply inaccurate. It wasn't their fault. It's just we didn't have access to bodies, okay? And so only really in the 15th or 16th centuries do people start understanding and appreciating the value of anatomical study. And by the 17th and particularly 18th century, it becomes a standard practice for the study of medicine. And not surprisingly, in the 18th century, you start to see for the first time halachic sources discussing this issue. Okay, because it wasn't being done until then. Right? It simply wasn't something that was a standard part of medical study or medical research. Now, if you want to think about why this would be a problem from the Jewish perspective, or even for that matter from the Christian perspective, I think there's some very clear and interesting psukim that discuss this issue. It's actually interesting that in Egypt and in ancient Greece, we do have a little bit of evidence of sometimes of opening bodies, and frequently it was from the lowest classes or convicted criminals or prostitutes or bodies of prostitutes, whoever it might be, meaning the people that are most disregarded in society as a whole are those whose bodies we're willing to open up. And in this context, it's very powerful to see what the Torah has to say about this. We're in Devarim, Perek Chaf Aleph, Deuteronomy 21. And the Torah is describing here someone who's been convicted of a capital crime and has therefore been executed. And it says, you've hung him now, you've killed him, you hung him on the tree, Pasuk Chaf Gimel, Lo talin livlato ala etz. Right? He might be guilty, but don't leave his body, right, remaining on the stake. You must bury it the same day. Ki kavor tikbrona bayomahu, ki klalat elokim taloi. For an impaled body is an affront to God. This is very significant. Why is an impaled body an affront to God? Rashi explains, Zilzulu shel melechu. It's a denigration of degradation of the divine king. For man is made in his image, right? Because God, human beings are the created in the image that Tselem Elokim. And therefore, the entire notion of saying that we're not going to treat a body, even the most low, degraded member of society, someone who's been put to death, right, for the capital punishment, nonetheless, Lo talin nivlato ki kavor tikbrona bayom hahu ki klalat Elokim taloi. And this is a very, very important factor to keep in mind. We're going to keep this in mind in the coming weeks as well. The Torah's message is we treat the human body with sanctity because humans were created in the image of God. This is a very important point about the origins of human dignity and how we treat bodies. And from here, and I'm stressing this point because as we're going to see, typically in most societies, the bodies who we treated with less respect are those who are of the lower classes or more vulnerable sociologically or economically or other ways. And the Torah's message is, don't do that. All human beings are created in the image of God. And from here, we learn three very important biblical prohibitions or laws related to the treating of the body. If a person says, don't bury me, what do we say? We don't listen to them. There's some things in life you can say, I don't want eulogies, right? We respect the person, they say don't want eulogies. We say, I don't want to be buried, we don't listen to them. Similarly, we don't get any benefit from the shrouds, from the things in the way of the body of the corpse, or even the things that the person is buried with. And we have a general prohibition of delaying burial, halanat metim. Okay, why halanat metim? Because in general, the human body should be treated with respect, should be buried as soon as possible. Of course, we do sometimes delay burial when it's necessary in order to let family members arrive or to make funeral arrangements. Why? Because this is l'chvod hamet. This is for the honor of the deceased. But as a general rule, we don't have, as you find in other faiths or cultures, we don't wait 6-7 days or anything like this in order to bury someone. We try to do it as soon as possible. Okay, so 3 prohibitions. Or 3 mitzvot. You have to bury someone. You shouldn't benefit from a corpse, and you should not unnecessarily delay burial. All of which, in one form or another, can become a real barrier when you think about it when it comes to the issues of medical research or medical study when it comes to human corpses, because we'll obviously make this more complicated as we go along, but seemingly all of those prohibitions should certainly apply to those cases. And indeed, remember I told you beforehand, in the 18th century, it starts to become standard in European medical schools and societies that they would do anatomical study of the body. And not coincidentally, in 1737, we have the first tshuva, first responsum on the topic by Rabbi Yaakov Emden, famous figure. And he's talking about something else, actually, but he gets to it inter alia, and he says as following, listen, you can't do this study because asur b'hana'a ki Yisrael. V'chen halakha b'vadai, the loshna nachri, loshna Yisrael. We're going to come back to this. He says, doesn't matter. It's a Jewish body or it's not a Jewish body. It's a Gentile body. It's forbidden to get benefit from the body in these cases. Okay? And therefore, the Rav Yaakov Emden says, right, it can't be that a Jewish medical student should be able to study on the human body. Okay, now, I'm sure many of you are immediate, but I want to stress this point for a moment. Why is it that he says that it applies equally to Jews and non-Jews alike? Because all human beings are created in the image of God, right? So there's no reason to think there should be any difference between the two of them. All human beings are created in the image of God. Okay. Now, I'm sure many of you are sitting here thinking, though, yes, but it's true that there might be prohibition here, but there should be some factor which overrides that prohibition. Okay. And that's the famous factor that we all know well, namely, pikuach nefesh, saving a life. In general, right, we have as prohibitions, but prohibitions are pushed aside when it's a matter of saving a life. So, of course, if Shabbat happens and someone falls very ill, they collapse, whatever it might be, we have a very clear law, pikuach nefesh, and having pikuach nefesh, suffix pikuach nefesh is doche Shabbat. Right? We push aside the requirements of Shabbat, the provisions of Shabbat, and every other requirement for that matter, in order to save someone's life. And so you could say immediately, and this indeed was being brought up, well, why isn't it the case that Pikuach Nefesh is Doche Shabbat? Excuse me, just like Pikuach Nefesh is Doche Shabbat, Pikuach Nefesh here should be Doche, should push aside, right, the three prohibitions of burying a person right away, of not getting benefit from it, of not degrading the body, and so on. Okay? So now I want to tell you a tale of 4 different cities. Okay, and on our journey right now, we're going to go to 4 different places around the world. Okay, starting in the city of London, and we're going to see how rabbis responded to this question. And as we're going to see now, this isn't just a theoretical question about, or even a practical, limited question. When it comes to Jews and studying the body in medical school, this becomes a deep question of public policy and the role of Jews in broader society. Okay? And the most famous responsum on this topic comes from the city of London. Okay? And the question is sent from London to Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, known as the Noda B'Yehuda. And Rabbi Yechezkel Landau is addressed this question from London, right? In a case in which there is a person who took it seems they were trying to test his illness of a prostate illness. And the questionnaire said to them, listen, maybe this is a case of pikuach nefesh, because if you can understand what the underlying cause of the disease was, we can save lives. And the Noda B'Yehuda says something very interesting. He says as follows: it might be true in general that there is medical knowledge that can save lives, but when we say that pikuach nefesh, saving a life, overrides prohibitions, that's only in very specific cases. Excuse me 1 second. I just have an issue with my screen here. So he says that's only. Here we go. Sorry, back again. See here. So he says here, that's only when there's a patient right in front of us. Sakanat nefashot lefanenu. So the classic case, Shabbat, you have a patient in front of you who is ill. That patient, right, you break Shabbat to save their life. But this is medical research, is not immediate, right? Sakanat nefashot lefanenu. It's not someone in front of us. It's accruing medical scientific research, or it's training a doctor to build up a certain amount of knowledge so he or she will be able to treat someone in the future. That's not enough of an immediate benefit for us to push aside prohibitions. But then look at something else he adds. This is very fascinating. He goes on and says, and don't even think about it. God forbid that we allow this body to have research done on him. Then we put this procedure. Why even Gentile doctors do not experiments in the science of surgery except for the bodies of executed criminals, right? And if, God forbid, we treat this lightly, they will cut up all corpses in order to learn the arrangement of internal organs and their natures. Okay, now, the first time I saw this, what's he basically saying? You give them an inch, they'll take a foot, literally. Okay, but if we were live in person, I'm sure you'll all be cracking up from that joke. But in any case, you gotta try some humor. I know these are difficult topics, but nonetheless. So when I first read this many years ago, I said to myself, what is this rabbi talking about? Like, are you really afraid that they're going to take all of our bodies? And then I started doing more research into understanding what was going on, excuse me, in the time period. And you see that quite interestingly, in the 19th century, the culture of how we treated human cadavers was not necessarily one of great respect. And here I quote from the book by Mary Roach, Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers. Let's just say, I'm not sure, this is not necessarily beach reading, Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers, but it's a wonderful and very interesting book. Mary Roach has a whole following. It's amazing to me. She's like this is like a best-selling book. I'm like, who's reading this book? In any case, but in the book, she describes what was going on in the 19th century of the anatomists, right? And how she describes how they had been successful in objectifying, in their own minds at least, the dead human body. Not only did they view dissection, the study of anatomy, as justification for unimproved disinterment, they saw no reason to treat the unearthed dead as entities worthy of respect. It didn't bother them that corpses would arrive at their doors, compressed into boxes, packed in sawdust, trussed up in sacks, roped up like hams. Okay, and engravings of the time period show dissection rooms where cadavers, intestines were hanging like parade streamers off the sides of tables, skulls bobbling in boiling pots, organs strewn on the floor being eaten by dogs. In the background, crowds of men gawk and leer. It's actually, Rabbi Fishman, a good timing that we have this class in the middle of the day because no one's eating at 3 o'clock, right? I don't want to ruin anyone's appetite here today, right? But nonetheless, you get the point that it was not the way that the body was being used and treated. It was not necessarily with great respect. And so the Noda B'Yehuda wasn't crazy when he said, don't give in on this issue because they're actually going to not treat our bodies with respect. But he also has a more fundamental argument in which he says this is not pikuach nefesh. Okay, so this is city number one. This is the city of London. City number two now takes us to Presburg, okay, to Central Europe. And here we go to a famous responsum of a man known by Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Chatam Sofer, who affirms, this is very, very important, 19th century religious decisor, and he affirms the ruling of the Noda B'Yehuda. But let's remember what the Noda B'Yehuda said. He said, and we saw this before from Yaakov Emden, it's forbidden to benefit from these corpses. If that's the case, not only should the Jews not give their bodies up for medical research, what else does this mean? Jews can't study to become doctors from human cadavers. So that's it. Every mother's dream for their son or daughter is now over. No more Jewish doctors. Right? And besides dousing the dreams, right, of our parents, right, you're talking to someone whose parents would have been very happy to be a doctor, but okay, I'm a doctor now, but not a doctor that helps you, on a plane if in case of emergency. I mean, you want to talk about Israel's constitutional crisis, I'm your man, right? He's got a PhD in law, but you have a problem on a plane, I'm not your man for that job. In any case, so Jews have a real issue here, not just of donating their bodies, but of how can you study in a medical school? What bodies are you going to study from? And so here the Chatam Sofer in the 19th century addresses this issue. And he says as follows. He says, listen, Jews have a certain concept of the way we think about dignity of our bodies, but that might not be shared by non-Jews. right? They don't think about the nature of the spirit in the same way that we do. And this is why they autopsy the body, have no worry about degrading it, and why it's permitted to derive benefit from their bodies. And the body of a Gentile is not referred to as a person anymore according to their views and beliefs. In other words, what the Khatam Sofer is saying, if the non-Jews don't want to treat the bodies of the same way we do, that's their choice. But of course, you might say, yes, but we don't think that, right? We think that all humans were created in the image of God. But here he picks up on a theme, which you see in others as well, that maybe the prohibition of desecrating the body isn't as severe, and the distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish bodies might exist. And therefore, he says it is okay, especially because they themselves think, according to their beliefs, that this is allowed. It's okay to study their bodies, but not for us to donate our bodies, our people's corpses. Now, if that makes you uncomfortable, there's good reason for that, because it seems to say that all humans are created in the image of God, but some were created more in the image of God than others. Right? Relates to a lot of issues. But this was, in fact, the policy that they took in Europe, and you can see this in other places as well. And this brings us to basically to a situation where Jews would state, we will not donate our bodies for medical research, but we will still go to medical school. And sometimes this worked out, and sometimes this did not. So, for example, in many places in Poland in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Jewish communities were told, we will not allow Jews into medical schools unless the Jewish community provides their share of corpses. Right? That's it. There is probably a missile of anti-Semitism going on here as well, right? That's in the background. But there was also a general belief, excuse me, that that if you're not going to, you can't take benefit if you're not willing to share as well in the communal in the communal provisions of corpses. And so Jews had a real dilemma in a lot of places in Europe. Also North America, there's a big controversies over this. In Denver, there's a big controversy. In Lvov, there's a big controversy. In various cities, there's also cases of grave snatching, literally of people or communal authorities or general authorities taking graves, literally corpses from the grave, in order to then do anatomical research. And this posed a great dilemma for Jews. But by and large, Jews stuck to the belief that we cannot allow this because it's not sakanat nefashot lefanenu. There's not an immediate amount of benefit that can justify violating these prohibitions. And I stress this again, in the background, there is this fear that what will happen to Jewish corpses and Jewish bodies if we give them over to the authorities. And so that brings us to our third city in our journey. This is the city of Washington, D.C. And here you have a tshuva from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, writing to Rabbi Moshe Schreyer, the head of the Agudat Yisrael, which is the political arm of like the right-wing yeshivish community in America. And Rabbi Feinstein tells him, "B'davar shenishal b'Washington," and the question which we got from Washington, "B'linishkat nasi," and he writes here in transliteration, "Office shel ha-president," right? The president here in sort of Yiddishization. Right? He says on this question of using body parts, I tell you quickly and briefly, there's nothing to talk about here. There's an absolute prohibition to take any form of bodies and even one organ or whatever it might be for the study of medicine, period. Okay? And that's sort of how I think it's pretty much been brought down in places across America and Canada and England and elsewhere. Jews do not donate our bodies to medical study. And that's fine, except you have a big problem. What's the big problem? Well, I say I have two problems. Three problems, actually. All right, make it a little complicated. A, you have to deal with this issue of we don't donate, but we do gain benefit from medical study, meaning we do participate in medical schools. B, we have the problem of how this works with the local medical or non-Jewish government authorities who don't always respect this. And C, you have a different issue, which is this all works fine and dandy if you're in Poland or in Denver or Montreal or somewhere else where there are, frankly, many people who have different views of how the sanctity of the body and are willing to donate their body for medical study. How's this going to play itself out, though, in the state of Israel? Where are the bodies coming from if they're not coming from the Jews? And so precisely at the same moment when in Poland and in America and in Canada, Jews are putting down their foot and saying, we will not donate our bodies to the medical center. At that very moment, someone comes up with the idea and says, you know what we need in the fledgling state, which isn't a state yet, of Israel? You know what we need? We need a medical school. Now, when was this idea first raised? So this is raised to start a medical school in 1925. When was Israel's first medical school founded? 1947. It took 22 years for the medical school to be founded, and in part over this issue, right? If you're going to start a medical school, you need to have bodies. If you need cadavers to study from, where are they coming from? Okay? And so what we're going to see now is a few different approaches to this issue. And in many ways, it gives us a very interesting question, which is, does the law change simply because we're now in the state of Israel? That's the only difference. I mean, in theory, this should be no different than this question, whether you're in America or Canada or England or in Israel. Sanctity of the body is the sanctity of the body. And yes, we're going to see the answers given in the fledgling yeshuv, right, that's trying to be built up before even the state of Israel is founded, are quite interesting and different from what we saw in Europe. So not all of it held this way. And I think you're probably thinking, the person we should turn to solve this issue, if it's 1925 in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, would be Rabbi Avram Isaac Kook, right? Rav Kook, famous first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of the land of Israel. And indeed, they asked Rav Kook this question: can we allow Jews to donate, bequeath their body to the medical school so we can start a medical school and train local doctors so that way we can have a healthy society? And Rav Kook says, absolutely not. It is totally prohibited. There's no difference between the way you do it in Lvov or the way you do it in Montreal or Denver or Washington or anywhere else. This is prohibited. And the rationale he gives is very interesting. He says, listen, this is a unique prohibition to the Jewish people. And this is unique related to this, how we view sanctity. And just the same ways that our diet, right, what we eat, kosher, right, is different because of this notion of sanctity, so too do we have to treat our bodies differently. And then look what he says about the problem. Therefore, we need to purchase cadavers at full price from the Gentile nations for scientific purposes. So what's the solution? Right? Get the bodies from the non-Jews. By goyim. You might say, wait, is this going to cause anti-Semitism? He says, no, there's no reason to worry that this will cause Gentile hatred. For the righteous among them know that in the end is this nation Israel that was chosen to bring the holy light of the knowledge of the true God to the world. Meaning we have a unique mission to the world. This is why it suffers endless travail. And this nation, therefore, is to be granted a certain degree of sacred privilege. In other words, the righteous amongst them will understand that with Kedusha comes a certain amount of responsibilities. And the ones that will be upset about this, well, they'd probably be anti-Semites anyway. And the bad ones among them will not stop defaming us, even if we dissect Jewish bodies. Okay, so here we are in our fourth city of Jerusalem. We were in London, we're in Presburg, we're in Washington, D.C., and now we're in Jerusalem. And Rabbi Cook says you got to just find alternative sources for the bodies. Now, this isn't going to work. And let's just think for a moment. I don't mean to say this in a provocative way, but we're not the only ones who care about the sanctity of the body. And let's say, for example, where Iranians, like in modern day Iran, get bodies, cadavers from for their medical schools? Not from Muslims. Right? So either they get them from non-Muslims living in Iran, or they get them from other places around the world. Now, I don't mean this to say this a provocative way, it's to saying, but you understand it raises all those questions and tensions, and particularly since the basis of this law is supposed to be a matter of the divine image of all human beings. Why should we distinguish between Jews and non-Jews? It's a very deeply disturbing, in some ways, possibility. And so the people that wanted to start medical schools in the land of Israel turned to other potential rabbis on this issue. And in particular, they turned, when the state was about to be founded, to the Rabbi Cook's successor, the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel, Rabbi Herzog. And Rabbi Herzog allowed it, sort of. He basically said as follows: there's a minority opinion out there which says that people can bequeath their body, right? It can be mochel. They can forgive, and they can say, I don't need my body to be treated with respect. I will allow you to use it after I die in the ways that you see fit for the sake of medical research. This is a curious position because, after all, whose kavod is it that is at stake when you're saying you can treat my body as you want? It's not personal kavod. It's not like a father or a mother waving their kavod to a child. It's the kavod of a God. But nonetheless, that was an opinion out there. Rabbi Herzog said, okay, if people are willing to do this in their lifetime and will treat the bodies with great respect, because remember, who's taking care of the bodies now? It's not the non-Jews in London. It's our own people. So we can control the way that the bodies are being handled, and therefore he'll allow it to happen. And that's how Hadassah Medical School opens up. But there's actually a much more interesting answer that was given at the same time that Rav Kook gave his answer. And this too was also in the city of Jerusalem. And it was given not by the Ashkenazic chief rabbi at the time, but by the Sephardic chief rabbi. And the Sephardic chief rabbi at the time was a man by name of Rabbi Sion Uziel. Rabbi Uziel writes a long treatise on this issue, but never publishes it for a good 20 years because it became such a heated issue and he felt he couldn't publish it. But Rabbi Uziel says something very, very interesting. And he says on this topic, let's go back to the original tshuva, the original response, not given in Jerusalem, but given to the city of London. Remember the Nod Yehuda? What did the Nod Yehuda say? It's not really pikuach nefesh. And Rabbi Uziel says, you know what? Is that really how medicine works today? Meaning the way that medicine works isn't, that pikuach nefesh in the sense of medical research works, is that they're saving a life now, but the way that knowledge gets accrued and the way that knowledge gets shared is certainly a way in which we can save lives. Now, it could mean that we don't have someone who's right here in front of us at this moment who we're going to save by violating Shabbat. That might be true. But let's say someone dies. Let's remember the case of London, some prostate issue. So maybe we don't have a patient right now in front of us who needs help with this issue, but it could be in Haifa they do, or a different city, or in Tel Aviv. And if that's not the same thing today, that might be the same, might be true tomorrow. And so one of the things that Rabbi Uziel tries to talk about, and he says as follows: anyone knows anything about medicine, how the discipline has developed and advanced, and what advantages it's brought to the world, cannot even have a moment's doubt about the benefits of medical research. It's just impossible not to understand that. This is critical, and especially if we can ensure that the bodies will be treated with respect and will be fully buried afterwards, and there'll be no money involved, and therefore there's no material benefit. I think actually this could be allowed. And the truth is that this idea was really spread and advanced by one of the later chief rabbis of Israel, Rabbi Goren, Shlomo Goren. And Rabbi Goren, when he discusses this issue, says as follows. When they were talking about in our earlier cities, whether it was Prague or London or Presburg or Washington, there they were discussing it in a very narrow ad hoc manner. Is the case in front of us a case of saving a life? But when you're building a state, when you have responsibilities for an entire medical system, like you do in Jerusalem, maybe then the answer is different, because it is pikuach nefesh. It's not because we have one particular life at this moment to save, but there's a general broader pikuach nefesh of saving an entire system, of saving this, preserving the health of an entire country. And so when you have the responsibility of taking care of a broader health network, that changes what the halakha is. Okay, and on this basis, right? On this basis, Israeli medical schools will accept, right, donations from Jews. And so when people say to me, well, are Jews allowed to donate their body to medical research? So I always tell them, in general, there's no shortage right now of people willing to donate bodies. And so those of us who care about these notions of Kedushat HaChaim and Kedushat HaMet and Kavod HaMet, I don't see any real urgency in terms of donating bodies to scientific research, unless there's some acute, unique situation, right? You know, you had some rare disease, or there's a real fear of some form of genetic, something genetic that could help your sibling, something along those lines. But, and the theory here that's at stake, I think, is very important, which it asks a broader question. When Jews have responsibility for a broader medical society, does halakha then get changed? And that's why it's so interesting that whereas this question was sort of unanimously answered in the diaspora as saying that it's forbidden, in the state of Israel became much more complex. And I want to show you one final tshuva and then say some final words, and we'll open up the conversation and questions. This was a tshuva response written by Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg to the Chaver Knesset by the name of Kalman Kahana, religious Chaver Knesset. Rabbi Weinberg is one of the great Gedolim, great rabbinic figures who's of Europe, who's living out the rest of his life after surviving the Holocaust in Montreux, Switzerland. And he's writing to him, he says, listen, when I got this question in the diaspora, I always said to people, it's forbidden. But when I'm asked the question from the state of Israel, and it's not an ad hoc case, but it's rather about how to run an entire society and have to have responsibility for an entire medical system, the answer is just going to be different in this circumstance. Okay? It has to be different, right? Because there's no viable alternative. And so once you take that approach, I mean, it becomes a very interesting question that once you have that approach, right, well, what else might this allow? Because once you say that you need certain things in order to make a state function, that raises a lot of interesting questions about police force, about running a proper meteorological society, right, weather, many other issues that don't necessarily be acute pikuach nefesh, saving lives, but could be very important for running a proper state. But the other issue, of course, which comes up here, is you see for the first time Jews are facing with a very acute question of how do we deal with a broader society in which there might be good reasons to have an interest in health policy regarding end-of-life care, but we're very afraid of the culture in which we live in and how they'll use or abuse our bodies. And I think you see that in London, you see that in Presburg, and you even see that in Washington and other places as well. There's a real concern that Jews have to be very careful. And this becomes an interesting case where our perspectives on these issues might change between whether we feel comfortable in the broader society in which we live in or don't feel comfortable. Jews generally feel more comfortable in the state of Israel. In Europe, they didn't feel that comfortable. But in North America, what's the case? What's going on there? Are we comfortable or not? Do we trust the system or not trust the system? And so it raises a lot of issues, this case example, in which, like I said to you beforehand, the issue of donating bodies to science today isn't that critical. There's plenty of cadavers to be donated. There's no shortage here as well. Right? But, and by the way, in medical schools, there's a whole debate today about how valuable it may or may not be in order to actually do anatomical study. Some doctors are very into 3D and virtual study. Right? There's a whole debate here about how important this might be. But the larger issue, which is at stake, is very, very important. And I think is going to, it continues to reverberate in a lot of different ways with the issues we're going to continue to discuss in the coming weeks. But also in many other issues that come up with healthcare and Jewish society. All right, I'm going to stop here, and I want to open up now for some questions and comments. Rabbi Fishman, can we do that? Can we open up as, I don't know if people like using the hand or you want to just raise your hand?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. People now have the ability to unmute themselves. So if anyone would like to ask a question to Rabbi Brody, please, now is your opportunity. It's completely unanimous. Oh, there we go. We do have a question. So,
yeah. Rabbi Brody,
Francis, yes, please.
Thank you. Rabbi Brody, who is in Israel? Who is ascertaining that after the autopsy that what is of the cadaver remaining or how it is that it actually is being treated and buried properly and so on? Is there some type of I don't want to say organization, but some type of...
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you look in the initial responsa, you'll see that there's an assumption that we can control this well and that the medical schools will make sure that, I don't get graphic here, but when you do a cadaver research, right, there's different parts of the body may come out and whatnot. You want to make sure those are all buried properly afterwards. And I'll say that and medical schools are really the ones that are responsible for this. It's not necessarily like a Hever Kadisha, like a burial society, meaning they're supposed to gather everything together. Obviously, the body's supposed to be stitched up, and then it's brought over to the Hever Kadisha for Tahara, for purification. I will tell you that I know from speaking to many medical students that the reality is not always the way we like it to be. And it's not because people are being crude. It's when you have to study for your anatomy exam, for like 8 hours, before high pressure, there's music in the background, people are drinking coffee, you got to lighten things up a little bit. So I don't always think it's being done in the ideal manner. I'm not saying it's even a critical way, but I'm just pointing that out. But, I do think that there is a certain amount of general, thoughtfulness about this issue, even though there's something certainly could be worked out better. In other places around the world, it really just depends on where you are. Depending on the medical school, depending on it, you could have cadavers lying around for a few days. I mean, keep in mind, we're in a society where people are cremating bodies today, right? In other words, this whole notion has been totally reformed in a lot of different ways. And so that's just part of the general cultural background. So this whole notion, like the sanctity of the body after death, it's sort of like, what are you talking about? For many people, that's a foreign idea today. It becomes complicated. And again, this is why I'm stressing public policy is not a halachic question in a vacuum. It's being asked in a very clear context, and that's why the context matters in terms of the answers you might give. Thank you for the question, David, and then Connie.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that very clear exposition of the situation. I can say that the reason I came in is to say that in all the medical schools I worked in, there is some very formal process of ascertaining that the bodies are decently treated after the dissection process is finished. I have to admit that you're right, that in the conditions of dissection, it's not all respect and purity. The one thing, though, which I was going to raise is under many conditions, when an autopsy is performed for medical reasons, tissue is kept after the autopsy is finished and isn't immediately available for burial. Is that specifically commented on? Is that specifically dealt with in Halachic rules?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a real issue because, well, there are two different cases, right? I mean, so I'd say in practice, the most important thing, and this is true for a lot of issues, is that there's an open line of communication with the local medical authorities or the hospital, and to make people and the Jewish community make sure there's an understanding of Jewish cultural sensitivities, right? Because that will help expedite burial and making sure that everything gets buried. But you were right, David, that there can be times in which, for various reasons, something can't, tissue or something else can't be buried right away. We're not going to overly delay burial for too long, and that could lead us to needing to do bury the rest or the missing tissue, whatever it might be, at some form of later stage. In order to do that, you have to have a burial society that knows how to work with its local medical authorities and to follow up with them on that. It's an issue. Those items have to be buried. They have to be buried. I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit next week also, but I just had a case, I was talking to someone with organ donation, and one of the organs that was retrieved, they weren't able to use in the end. It wasn't healthy enough to transplant to someone else. And the mom is telling me literally, like, at the funeral, like they brought back, in this case, the pancreas, to make sure it gets buried with the body. And she's describing this to me as like Monty Python. But then I'm thinking to myself, like, I get it, but you should know that this was a tremendous act of Kavod Hamet. The hospitals did the right thing. They made sure the family got back and buried it. It's a very, very important value to us. Connie.
Actually, part of my question was addressed. So organ donation is generally considered okay. That's a question. There's a question mark.
So the answer to that question is next week's class.
Next week's,
we're going to discuss organ donation. But you're already seeing here how some of these issues of the Jews benefiting from a system, but not giving to the system, are going to come up, of course, in organ donation as well. But organ donation, we're going to see a little bit next week into that. So I like having the
so that's why I took out. Yeah, I realized afterwards. So
that's fine, but that's good. You highlight the cliffhanger. Arthur.
I'm a bottom line guy. If somebody would come to me and ask me, does Judaism, does Halakha allow autopsies or not? Well, what would I tell them? It depends. It depends on this. Depends on that. What kind of answer would you give? I mean, so your whole talk was the answer, but still, what answer would you give to somebody in B'Kitzur?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's a fair one. It's a fair one, although, as you know, many times the answers that rabbis will give is, it's a disagreement. But I don't want to give that answer. And this is actually what you're getting to, Arthur, is a very important point. When you get to questions of public policy, the nuances of rabbinic disagreements are hard to bring to a public policy debate. I mean, this isn't our topic, but let's talk about, which I don't want to talk about, but I'll just mention. Let's talk about the question of abortion. Hugely sensitive issue, let's say in the United States and other places as well. The Jewish perspective on abortion is much more complex than pro-life and pro-choice. Right? It's much more nuanced than that. I have my own take on this, and if you look up, you'll search, Google search Shlomo Brody, abortion, the Federalist, and you'll see I wrote about this at length. Okay, it's much more complex than that, but are we relevant to public discourse or not? So if we're going to be relevant, we have to have a position. It can't just say it's a machloket. So if you would ask me about this issue, what's the Jewish public policy when it comes to donating one's body to science, you have to distinguish the cases. When it's a case in which there is an immediate benefit to the deceased, or an immediate healthcare benefit, with, let's say in the case of Corona, it could have been, or a criminal case, we allow autopsies to take place. This is for the sake of the kavod of the met and the immediate public health emergency. When it comes to questions of donating a body to science for general research or for general medical study, Jews, generally speaking, will take a position of saying that this is something that, given our cultural beliefs, we do not allow it, but we understand and respect why that might be different in different circumstances, and certainly understand and respect why others would donate the body to science, and insist that when that's done, our culture should be created in a manner in which we treat those bodies with respect and bury them as the deceased wished. Okay, so that was why I would tell you, and therefore I would, if you would ask me, would you encourage someone to donate their body to science if they're a Jew? No, I would not. But would I respect others who do that? Yes, I would. Now again, but you're getting to, and I see the look in your face, like, what type of public policy is that? Does that mean we have a different belief for Jews and non-Jews in public policy? And the answer here might be yes, but the question then becomes, the obvious question is, well, A, is that public policy you can share with the world? And B, how does this play itself out in Israel? You have responsibility for the entire state. So I don't know if that answered your question or made things more confusing, but that's at least my honest answer to it.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Rabbi Fishman, should we call it a day? Or one more question? Esther, go ahead.
Last question, Esther. Yes.
You're still muted, Esther.
You're on mute, Esther.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. Supposing studies have to be done through surgery to remove tissue in someone's organ, be it a brain or whatever, so that they could tell over future years by studying that piece at little bits at a time for those years. Now, what happens to that tissue? Does it go back in? Should it be requested before they do it, that they give it back, even though it's going to take 5 years or 10 years or God knows what? What happens to that?
Everything that can be buried should be buried. And so at some later point, I mean, this comes up all the time when you're dealing with finding body all the time, but it comes up in Israel. We have bodies of soldiers that are found, or remains of soldiers that are found. Or it comes up in Europe, by the way. Occasionally, it was last year, I think. One of these trips to Poland, and they found bones, and somewhere, or whatever it might be. If it can be buried, anything that can be buried should be buried. And so, for some reason, there's some form of anatomical gift or study has to be taken place, which could be true on an ad hoc basis for sure. Right? But part of the condition should be is that when it's no longer needed, that should be buried. Sometimes with tissue, it's not relevant anymore, right? Decomposes, etc. But many times, there are things that can be buried, and anything that can be buried should be buried, and it's a great mitzvah. And I think it's an important mitzvah because it highlights a general perspective of ours on the sanctity of life, the sanctity of the dead.
Okay, so really you have to use common sense.
Yeah, well. But it's more like common sense goes a long way for a lot of things, but it's more than just common sense. It's now persistence in explaining our cultural, right? And we call it a cultural sensitivity, right? But it's a way of explaining, and I think a lot of people, there's a lot of goodwill to honor people's cultural sensitivities today.
Okay.
All right.
Wow, what an incredible presentation. Rabbi Brody, thank you so much. This was fascinating and truly edge of your seat material. You really brought it to life in a profound way, in a very realistic and engaging way, and we thank you so deeply for that. I hope that everybody enjoyed this afternoon's presentation. I'd also like to thank Rabbi Brody for, although not feeling on the top of his game, staying up late. Rabbi Brody is speaking to us live in Israel, and it's a little later there than it is in Montreal right now. And so we truly appreciate your efforts and a beautiful presentation. Hopefully this has whetted your appetite. We have 2 further presentations that Rabbi Brody will touch on in the areas of euthanasia and in the areas of organ donation, as Connie alluded to a little earlier. And so we welcome you back for the next 2 Sundays at 2 p.m. Montreal time, where Rabbi Brody will continue. I would like to just bring to your attention, hopefully you have received this brochure in the mail by now. My camera is not letting it show so perfectly, but hopefully you've received this programming brochure in the mail. And I just would like to bring to everybody's attention a slew of new programming that is taking place. Please be aware that tomorrow evening at 8 p.m., we're going to be starting a new series called Bold, Brilliant, and Banned: Controversial Books That Changed the Jewish World. And that's going to be with Rabbi Ariel Rakovsky. And then in person for the next 4 Tuesday nights at the Shah, we have an opportunity of modern Hebrew literature taught by Dr. Menachem Rothstein. There are a slew of new and other programs that we encourage you to attend. And for now, we're going to pause, wish everyone well. Thank you once again, Rabbi Brody, and we look forward to continuing with you next week.
Are these